Now we are moving on to the next session. The next session is the speaker going to be M. Suresh Kumar sir on the topic of good psychiatric practices in the context of empowered person with mental illness. The session will be chaired by Dr. K. Ashok Reddy. We welcome you, sir. Over to the dice, sir. Well, I would like to welcome Dr. KRK, sir. Welcome you, sir. Over to the dice. Dr. M. Suresh Kumar, sir, joining online. Over to you, sir.
Very good morning to all the delegates in the hall and online. Today is a very important topic which is applicable to each one of the practicing psychiatrists. The topic is about good psychiatric practice. This is taken from the good clinical practice, I think, what is popularized through the clinical research works. And in good clinical practice, not just research, but as a psychiatrist, we are clinicians, we are teachers and researchers. I think it's applicable to all the areas. We'll be discussing about attributes of a good psychiatrist, which is applicable, which gives a good image of the psychiatrist in the society as well. It mainly talks about the confidentiality issues, the consent issues, the rights of patients, and the protection of the patients, benefits of the patients, etc. On a good important topic, Dr. M. Suresh Kumar from Chennai, a very highly learned person, a good orator, is going to talk about it today. I request our co-chairperson, Dr. R.K. R. Krishna, to introduce the speaker to the audience.
First of all, I should thank Professor Suresh Kumar for gracefully accepting to talk at a very, very short notice within a couple of days, because our speaker, Dr. Paul Russell, suddenly fell sick and he couldn't come, he couldn't prepare. So, as I told yesterday, if you want to have a man to talk on any topic at any time, at any stage, it is Professor Suresh Kumar. And he needs no introduction. He is orator, spellbinder, as we were discussing yesterday's felicitation. He is into teaching. Teaching is his passion and his breath. So I thank Dr. Suresh and I request him to give the lecture on good clinical practice, which is as Dr. Ashok Reddy. He is again he was retired from Institute of Mental Health, Hyderabad, all administrative post, constitution, everything he had gone through. So he is the right person to chair the session and I may fill in. Thank you, sir. Welcome, Dr. Suresh, sir.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. Good morning. At the outset, my salutations to the chairs, my good friend, Dr. Ashok Reddy and Dr. Ramakrishnan. I think my really thanks are due to Dr. Ramakrishnan for asking me to talk on a subject, having absolute faith in me that will be able to deliver. Thank you so much for having that faith in me. So what I'll be doing today is to give you some glimpses of what a good psychiatric practice should be in the context of people with mental illness empowerment. I think really the emphasis on empowered people, how as psychiatrists we can empower people with mental illness. and the psychiatric practice associated with that. First and foremost, I think we need to begin by asking the simple question: why should mental health professionals empower people with mental health problems? Is it important? Why should we embark on this journey of empowering people? The answer is, people with mental health problems and also the carers, the families, traditionally are not involved as equal partners in the decision-making process in the mental health services. For long, I spent about 40 years. In the beginning of my career, we never thought of involving the patients as equal partners and also the family members as equal partners. We took the right of taking every decision, believing that we know everything, we know what is good for them. But I think thinking about it now today looks like it's a horrendous mistake many of us have done. And I think it's very important we need to involve them as equal partners. Only then the word collaboration becomes meaningful. Second, for many, many years, for centuries and decades, people with mental health problems have been at the risk of social exclusion and also discrimination. I think the stigma not only comes from the general public and the communities, sometimes the stigma can also come from mental health professionals, and the discrimination can stem from the mental health professionals and the staff with the mental health institutions. So continuously, the people with mental health problems have the risk of social exclusion and discrimination. And I think, so it becomes necessary to empower people with mental health problems. What exactly you mean by empowerment in the context of mental health? Because we use empowerment when it comes to women, when it comes to disability. So what does it mean when we are talking about empowerment in the context of mental health? First, what is the level of choice we give to them? We can talk about choice, but what is the level of choice? Do we actually ask them what kind of a treatment they want? What kind of a medication they'll be comfortable with? Are we willing to listen to their side effects and change it? Are we willing to listen to their woes and correct it accordingly? So what is the level of choice in whatever services we are providing? Second, what is the kind of an influence they have on our decision making? Do we actually influence? Do they influence us at all? And more importantly, what is the control they have over their own body and mind and their own treatment and services? So I think whenever we offer mental health services, which is going to be impacting on their own lives, we think it is going to have a positive impact. We really have to think it is going to be a positive influence. We need to also examine what is the level of choice, what is the level of influence, and what is the level of control we can have. And I think one of the key things mental health professionals should do is to remove all the obstacles, all the barriers. Some of the barriers and obstacles are formal, some of them are informal. That's very, very important. We need to remove all the obstacles that interfere with the empowered service to them. More importantly, there is no power equation between the patient and the doctor. And I think the power relationship is very important. And the persons are considered as inferior. I am the doctor, you take the order from me, I know it all, this is good for you. That's not going to work. That power relationship has to change with the individuals with mental health problems. Also, the kind of services that are available, whether it is an NGO operated, whether it's a government operated, it doesn't matter. Whoever is providing the service, we need to treat people with the equal power relationship. And also, the governments should also be looking at people with mental illness as equal citizens in this country and should be really not interfering with the power relationship. So when we talk about empowerment, it is about addressing the barriers, removing the barriers, some of them formal, some of them informal, and actually changing the power dynamics that exist between the persons and others. So that's very important. This has been articulated about a decade ago by WHO Europe, and thankfully I was part of these discussions. And I think after that, A lot of things have happened in the European countries. Slowly, if you look at the Mental Health Care Act today, it encompasses a lot of things of what we talk about because it's right-centric at this point in time. Okay, so I'm going to move from that concept of why empowerment to how do we actually have some practice tips while we are trying to empower persons with lived experience of severe mental illness. Today, I think the way we use people, the nomenclature itself has become different. When I was a student, I used to call a schizophrenic. And then people said, no, you are actually stigmatizing the person by calling Suresh Kumar a schizophrenic. And I think people said, Suresh Kumar, a person with schizophrenia. That's how we said, a person with diabetes, right? Suresh Kumar, a person with schizophrenia. Today, people are saying, even that is not okay. We need to say a person with a lived experience of schizophrenia. Because each of the lived experience is unique. You look at 3 or 4 people with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, they are not one and the same. Their experience is not the same. So you can't really think all experiences are uniformly same. So people are saying, Suresh Kumar with a lived experience of schizophrenia is a better way of understanding, giving respect to the lived experience, which is unique in nature. It may look like a very Anglican concept at this point in time. Even in psychiatrists, among psychiatrists, we have not started to use the word lived experience of schizophrenia. In this conference also, we haven't heard it so much. I'm sure, in few years to come, when a lot of people get actively involved and the empowered people will force us to use this nomenclature, that people with lived experience of severe mental illness, for example. So empowering persons with lived experience of severe mental illness is the first thing we should ask ourselves. What are the things that we should be doing? I project 4 things as key in any practice, whether you are a private practitioner, whether you're working in an NGO, working in a government. I think it is cutting across board and say there are 4 practical tips we should have. One is what Dr. Ashok Reddy said, protection of human rights. I think this has become so vital to our services. All our services should be right focused. There is no way we can intervene and not protect the human rights of people whom we serve. Second, as I said earlier, they have to be treated as equal partners, meaning they have to be included in the decision-making process. It can't be unilateral. It can be unidimensional. It can't be one-dimensional. Number 3, the service that we offer to them should be quality assured. As far as possible, it should be a high quality care. And we should be accountable for the services we provide to them. Every service that we provide is accountable. We can't escape by saying that I did it with good faith. One should be accountable. 4th, we should facilitate access to information and resources. People have the right, every person who seeks help from us and from the services and from the government have the right to access information as well as access to resources. So we must facilitate this access to information and resources. So these 4 things are important practical tips: human rights, decision-making, high quality care and accountability, and access to information and resources. Let's talk about protection of human rights. I think, very simply speaking, Dr. Purna Chandrika, the director of our institute in Chennai, has done tremendously well in making sure that people who are residents of this Institute of Mental Health have got the right to vote. She has registered them in the last election. So I think every person who runs a residential care facility must make sure the people who are residing in there, people who are actually using the mental health services, have the right to vote. That's a fundamental constitutional right given to every citizen, and I think we should exercise that. Second, we are really lagging behind in this country. We must fight and advocate for employment legislation, because often the employers discriminate at the work setting. For example, somebody is working in a BPO, somebody working in a corporate company, and he gets treatment for me for the lived experience of schizophrenia. He takes a break for about 21 days. And then I give a certificate stating that he had suffered from this particular diagnosis, and I've been treating him. He has remitted. He's ready to join work. but then they're not accepting this person. They are looking for a possibility. The human relationship department, HR department, is looking for a chance to remove him on the grounds that he has had mental illness. My certificate of fitness is actually used against him rather than for him. So it's extremely important. A diagnosis of a mental illness should not be the basis for discriminating and actually discharging them from their employment. This is very important. We need to advocate for it with all the corporates and all the government institutions. The country should also have an employment legislation to cover the needs of the family. What happens if somebody falls ill? Should you not actually make some of the family cadets to be given a job on a compensation ground? We do it for other things. Why not for mental illness? That's very, very important. These are human rights we should be fighting for as mental health professionals. Some of them are already there. Some of them are not there as yet. I think we should be really fighting for including them. Second, talk about decision making. I think we have to make very clear, not only the users, service users, but also their families should be involved in the mental health policy and legislation. I'm very happy to say, I'm sure it's happening in every state. You have the state mental health body, and there is a constituted body. There are members who are included in it. That includes mental health professionals, but also it includes a person with a lived experience and also a person who's a family caregiver. So it's very essential that we include such kind of people in the development of mental health policy and legislation, because we need to hear their voices. We need to reflect their voices in our policy legislation. And I think this is something I'm very, very fond of. And I think I will tell you the example of what I've done in my life. Both users and the families have the authority in the process of designing, planning, implementing services for them. If it is for them, why can't include them? That's essentially the question we should be asking. If it is about them, they should be part of it. So I think involving them from the very beginning, from the design, in planning and implementing and even evaluating the mental health services is very critical. And third component is offering the highest quality service. I think here is very, very important. We need to understand people with mental health problems and their families have access to appropriate mental health services. This is one of the doctrines which is actually stated in our Mental Health Care Act. It actually calls and says everybody should have an equitable care. Every person with the illness should have an equal opportunity to seek appropriate mental health services. But even though the act is there, the resources may not be there. I think using the act, we should fight and ask for appropriate funding for it, because the funding at this point in time is very limited. We should be fighting for it. And people with mental health problems should also have access to the general health services. Often I go to a general hospital, to a surgical ward. Somebody with the lived experience of a severe mental illness, having a severe wound, which almost becomes gangrenous, the surgeon is more reluctant to see him and address him. There are people like Dr. Ramakrishnan who work with other hospitals very diligently and take the extra care. Yesterday when Dr. Arun was talking about how people like some of the orthopedic surgeons and other people, like ophthalmologists are willing to provide free services. It's all commendable, but it talks about how much of a work people have put in to have that kind of a collaboration. It does not happen automatically. People with severe mental illness are treated in a very discriminative way in general medical and surgical services, because it is the general medical community which stigmatizes the people with mental illness greatly than other people. So that I think we need to really fight for and make people to become very sensitive to that. Thirdly, people with mental health problems have the opportunity to be involved in their own planning and review of care. If I'm a diabetic, my diabetologist asks, what kind of a treatment do you want? Do you want this medication versus this medication? Would you like to be on insulin? I'm involved in the care. He puts you all the options before me and I choose it. Similar kind of a planning and review, they should be involved. So high quality care, not only for mental health services, but also for physical services should be available to them. Similarly, not just the people with lived experience, but also their families. They have to be involved, because often the families are the ones who are actually taking care of the burden of the family. And I think are the people with the lived experience. So it is the families also should be involved in the planning and review of care. And often it's a good thing. If I am running a rehabilitation center, if I'm running a hospital, I think it's very important I include some people in the board who are service users and families and ask them to inspect and monitor the services and give their feedback. I visited your center. I think that the people are not being treated well or treated well, whatever it is. Their inspection, their monitoring will help to improve services. We need not take it as a criticism. I think that's the only way we can improve our own services to the people. People with mental health problems and their families should also be involved in education and training of the staff. Sometimes the staff are not very educated. Often you go to any center, anywhere in the country, around like government institutions, NGO institutions, private institutions, you can have very qualified psychiatrists and psychologists and social workers. But people work at the lower level, who actually provide the day-to-day care to the people. And I think this ward boys and like ayas who are at the very last level in providing the services, they may not be educated about mental illness. I think it's very, very important to provide the right kind of education to them. And I've been talking to SCAR for a long period of time to provide formal education to people and educate them about mental illness so they can treat mental illness, people with lived experience better. And I think in such kind of education, having the people who are service users and the families is critically important. It makes a lot of difference when somebody who's a service user comes and narrates a story of how he was treated, good or bad, in an institution. That really makes the attitude of the people to become different. And I think one of the important things, the last one, is about the access to information and services. When we talk about access to information and services, please remember, every person has the right to access their medical records. Somebody asks for a medical record, if there's been inpatient, comes and tells, I want to know what happened to me, please give me this. You don't have to tell them, you go to the RTI and apply, only then I'll give it to you. He has a right, it's about him. And whatever your records you have, you please give a copy of it to him. He has access to his record. Others do not have the access, but the person who's had a lived experience has a right to access his medical records. And also, we should ensure, wherever possible, they have the access to affordable legal support. I think they want the legal support. We should be able to provide the legal support to them because that's very important. Similarly, there are state benefits available. Mr. Shankar Narayan was talking about it yesterday. When it comes to state benefits, people with physical disability get major chunk of it. But people with mental disabilities and challenges are not getting enough equitable access to the state benefits. I think that's very important. Even though there is a, like Disability Act, which is very right-oriented, there are benefits associated with it. You need to ask people, how many people with intellectual disability, with mental challenges, actually have equitable access to the state benefits? Surprisingly low, unless people like Dr. Ramakrishnan fight for it and get it for them. Similarly, you all know there is so much public fund available. And that kind of a public funds should also be available to user and family organizations. You start a family group, you start a user group. I think we should be able to access the public funds and get the money to run it. This is a very important thing for access to resources. Again, people should also know where services are. If I am from Chennai, if I have a family member who's suffering from a lived experience, I must know what services are available in Chennai. Do we have a service directory which tells me where are free services available, where are cost-effective services available, where pay for services are available? I don't have that. And I think people go from pillar to post, waste a lot of money. So such kind of availability of appropriate information, either in the net or in a directory, is very important. And also, I think we need to really support the family members. This is a very shameful affair in this country. Every other country has a social security benefit. I think if somebody has a lived experience, the family is given so much of a support. It is a state's responsibility. If I'm in UK, if I'm in Australia, if I'm in New Zealand, if I'm suffering from a lived experience, the state takes care of me. The family is not burdened so much. Whereas in this country, if I have a son or a daughter with a lived experience, is entirely my burden. I spend all my property, all my wealth on looking after him. It's very wrong. I should be given the proper kind of a support in actually shaping up my role as a carrier. So the welfare benefit system we are talking about in this country talks about so many things, so many segments, but avoids talking about this challenged population of people with lived experience. So as mental health professionals, I also think it's a good practice to fight for it. And I moved from severe mental illness to something which is very close to my own heart, namely substance use disorder. Now, what I've done in my own life, trying to empower persons with the lived experience of substance use disorder. You know, when I used to work in the Institute of Mental Health, I was the first person to start the drug treatment facility inside the Institute of Mental Health. Very soon I realized people who are substance users are tremendously intelligent. When I saw the first heroin user in the 1980s, I knew nothing about heroin. I talked to one Mr. Yam, who was my first client, who became my educator. He started talking about so much. He actually educated me. Hours and hours I spent with him to learn about heroin, what it is, and what can be done to even help people with heroin. I had simply no knowledge at all after qualifying for MD and proclaiming myself as a drug dependent specialist. I know nothing about it. This Mr. Yam, young, dynamic boy, who was a graduate from a college, educated me. And then later on in my life, when I started doing work, I started using substance users as my researchers to research on other substance users. So when I was discussing with a senior colleague from the Institute of Maudsley, you know, when he visited Chennai and then visited with me to the various slums, and I took him around and introduced the substance users, he called them as cultural experts. And I loved that word. He said, these people understand the subculture of drugs than you and me. They can educate us. Why don't you treat the substance users as cultural experts? So we wrote an article long time back describing substance users as cultural experts, how we use substance users to unearth information relating to substance use. From that day, anything that we did for nearly 3 decades, I worked with substance users in different countries. My whole logic was nothing for them without them. So we came up with the slogan of nothing for us without us, borrowing from the HIV world. And I think we used it very strongly in the drug use field. We involved them in the design of the service, in the implementation of the service, in the evaluation of service. Right across Iran to Afghanistan to China, I did it. Whenever I go to a country, the first thing I do is to assemble a group of cultural experts, substance users, have a dialogue and discuss with them, and then design the project, and then implement it, and then make them to evaluate it. And that has become very robust. That's almost become the prototype of what we do work today with drug users. This is a new work that I had done very recently in Northeast India. When Northeast India presented on methamphetamine abuse in Northeast, Myanmar is supplying drugs to Northeast, and a lot of people in Manipur were using it. I went across to the border and I was working with them exclusively using these cultural experts. I could unearth so much of information relating to methamphetamine use for the first time in the country. And we documented for UNODC. Completely the work was done by substance users themselves as researchers. And I believe very strongly in the peer support mechanisms. Thankfully, our voices have been accepted by the government. Today, you'll be surprised. There are about 300 odd government-owned centers run by Government of India through National AIDS Control Organization. They provide opioid substitution therapy, and most of these programs are supported by former substance users. And these people are offering peer support mechanisms to people with substance use disorder. So they've actually been supporting community-based organizations which are essentially run by former drug users. Today, for example, in Chennai, Institute of Mental Health provides drug treatment facility for people with lived experience of substance users, but they work very closely, collaboratively with a community-based organization called Hopers, which is essentially comprising of former substance users. From the director to the medical officer to everybody who's working there has a background of substance use. And working very closely with them, they're able to help. Dr. Shweta is running the center under the leadership of Dr. Purna Chandrika. This is happening in our own backyards. And lastly, I want to say, to our credit, we have created drug user groups. And I want to say this, it looks like this is an illegitimate group. People are using illicit drugs. And I call them and group them together and they call them as drug users group. In every state, we have formed state drug users group. In Northeast India, there are so many drug users group. They are participating in every discussion on drug abuse at the state level. No policy level discussion in Manipur or Nagaland or Mizoram happens without the inclusion of these drug user groups. The same thing happens in Delhi. Same thing happens in Tamil Nadu also. So I think there is a power of collective experience. When people come together, I think these are people who have given up drugs and then they are really reformed today and they are able to offer meaningful, like inclusion and then meaningful involvement will really result in meaningful results. So drug users group, we are able to do it. We should draw similar lessons and say what we can do with other groups, like what we are dealing with. Then I move now to empowering persons with lived experience of anxiety and depression. I want to talk about it because the prevalence of anxiety and depression is so high. Anywhere in the world, people will say it is between 10 to 40%. If so many people are going to be suffering with the lived experience of anxiety and depression, and a lot of them can be easily empowered. They can't be treated in the same way like we have treated traditionally people with severe mental illness. And how do you empower people with lived experience of anxiety and depression? I want to talk about something very, very important. This is science-based. Wellcome Trust have put in the maximum money today for youth mental health than any other public trust. And people who are sitting in this audience, they want to apply for funds. The place to go to is Wellcome Trust. If they are looking at illnesses like anxiety and depression, what should be done? And what they're looking at is, they ask people who are young people with a lived experience to understand from them what has worked for them, rather than asking mental health professionals what works for them. It is just the other way. I not go to Ashok Reddy and ask him, sir, what do you think is your best treatment for anxiety and depression? You go to a person with a lived experience of anxiety and depression, ask him, what do you think has worked for you? Can you tell me? What is the evidence you have that something has worked for you? We respect that person and take his opinion. Based on that, Wellcome Trust very recently in 2021 has come up with what they call as active ingredients. Active ingredients are what is the mechanism that actually helps people in the real world. You'll be surprised that what we traditionally do is there, but not many things that we do is also there. Number one, the focus is on behavior and activities. First and foremost, people are saying behavioral activation is critical for people with lived experience of anxiety and depression. What do you mean by behavioral activation? You have to increase their engagement with positive activities. You involve them in music, you involve them in theater, you involve them in, like a club, involve them in sports. That's called as behavioral activation. By just engaging them with positive activities, they can be helped. It's a very simple strategy. I think as psychiatrists, it's our duty to offer this to the people because it's evidence-based. Second, whatever you do with the people, you don't do it alone. It has to be a collaborative goal setting and tracking. If you do it all by yourself, you're going to fail. You consult this person, you set up a collaborative goal, you work with them, you track the progress, it's going to work better. I loved when Arun Kumar was involved in arts. That's going to be the game changer tomorrow. Engaging people with arts is one of the best ways to deal with mental health problems like anxiety and depression. The people who have been involved in arts, whatever form that is, arts in any form, and I think that's a fantastic treatment, evidence-based treatment for people. And also exposure. People with phobias, I think we need to ask them to face the fear in a planned manner, which all know that that's what we do in behavior therapy. Not to forget, the physical activity is extremely critical. If you do not offer the advice of a physical activity of minimum 30 minutes, 150 minutes per week to a person, you are failing in your duty. You are failing in your duty. It's not enough you prescribe medication and give a behavior therapy. You tell them about the physical activity. You must also encourage him to involve in problem solving, particularly by brainstorming. 4 or 5 people sit together and brainstorm and solve the problem. There could be many ways to solve. There could be alternates to look at. Of course, we have to teach relaxation techniques. The relaxation techniques could be them through typical Jacobson relaxation or yoga or whatever. I think these remote measurement technologies are very important. Apple watches telling you what your pulse rates are. Your Fitbit watch is telling you how many, steps you're taken. All these kind of remote technologies will also be very helpful in people monitoring themselves. So don't throw the technology away. Self-disclosure, meaning you share your information with trusted people, trusted actors and trusted channels. You go disclose to them. That's talking about your own experience, your own close friend or a family member or a trusted actor is very important. I think we need to also not only work on the behavior and activities, but also work on the beliefs and knowledge. I think this is vitally important. We need to connect people with their own culture. You can't take people away. If somebody is hailing from Trichy, belonging to a particular culture, I don't want to disconnect him from this culture and put him somewhere. He needs to connect with his own culture. That is going to make a big difference to him. Mental health literacy is very important. Don't assume that people are literate. Even the most educated ones are mental health illiterate. We found it in our recent work. Recently, we've done a work with SCARF. We found shockingly, even in workplace settings, even in colleges, even in school settings, mental health literacy is abysmally low. Sense of purpose. If you can actually make people to find a purpose in their life. Many people ask, what is the purpose of life? Why are you living? That's a very important question, maybe a philosophical question. Asking that is very relevant. Self-evaluation. I think we all of us to do our own rating. We don't have to allow somebody else to rate us. We need to rate ourselves. And I believe very strongly, religious and spiritual beliefs are vital. If not religion, the spiritual beliefs are very important. That can actually work against anxiety and depression. So those are the beliefs that you could work on. All I'm saying is all evidence-based. It has worked very well in the work. You may not like it, but that's how it works. It's all ingredients identified and distilled by serious researchers. And brain-body functions. It's very important to teach people to have a better life sleep-wake cycle. I haven't learned it well, and I know I'm not right at that, but I think at least I should be teaching people to have a better circadian rhythm. Sleep at a proper time, sleep at a particular, wake up at a particular time. Maintaining that sleep rhythm and circadian rhythm is very important. Gut microbiome is a very recent one. People are talking about psychobiotics, how some of the prebiotics and things are going to be extremely useful. Food can change the way we think. And so this gut microbiome is something which is going to be the future of tomorrow. Omega-3 supplements have been touted. There are some conflicting evidences to that. Reducing the levels of inflammation in the body is very important because, for example, COVID that produces so much of anxiety and depression because it produces brain inflammation. There are a lot of inflammatory processes that happen to the brain, which can result in anxiety and depression. So reducing the levels of inflammation, whatever way you do, is going to be extremely critical. That means we need to work very closely with physicians and pediatricians. And finally, antidepressants also have a role. So please don't assume when it comes to anxiety and depression, our sole thing is about SSRI. SSRIs are very important, but I think 20 more active ingredients I talked about is also very important for empowering people. That is going to work very well for people. And I think you also have to work on the cognitive and attentional skills by making them know how they feel and the ability to shift their perspective, what we call as decentering. And emotional regulation is another important thing. Grief reduction. I think we need to really use strategies to how to reduce feelings of grief. These are all very important. I want to talk about one thing which we are doing a lot called hopefulness. I never thought hope could be taught. Today, I go to the schools and we are training and teaching people about hope. Dr. Shiv Prakash, a very young, dynamic child and adolescent psychiatrist belonging to SCARF, has won a proposal from Templeton Charity Foundation for SCARF, which I'm also an investigator. We are trying to work on character strength, gratitude, which is about past, kindness, which is about present, and hope, which is about future. We are embarking on the journey of character development to school children. In a randomized controlled trial, we're going to test it and say, you do this, this is going to improve mental health later on. These are game-changing work that we are doing at the community level. Finally, I want to say we need to reduce perfectionism. Perfectionism is not really required. If you deal with too much perfectionism, they're also going to lead to the neuroticism and anxiety and depression. And promoting self-compassion, kindness to oneself, love for oneself is also very important. You have forgotten that. Finally, I think the human connection is important. One of the themes of this conference is connectedness. We need to connect with people. I miss that connection of being there in Madurai, really seeing and hugging Dr. Ramakrishnan and handshaking with Ashok Reddy. Miss that connection. You need the human connection. I think that today people are connecting digitally. That digital quality social connection is also very important. The family connection is important. Loneliness reduction is important. Neighborhood cohesion is important. These are all very important ingredients. And I think peer support is a very vital thing. In the workplaces, work alliance, those are all very, very important. So I think lastly, I also want to say, sometimes socioeconomic factors can also be very important. For example, to a farmer giving cash, like giving some incentive, cash incentives to people, that can be really useful. And today we are talking about environments being very mental health friendly. You have a concrete environment like Chennai. This is going to really create a lot of mental health problems. You have green spaces like in Tiruchi you have, for example, a lot of green spaces. Access to green spaces will actually make people mental health friendly. Looking at the green spaces, I think people are designing the workplace also in a way that it has more green spaces within the house, in the workplaces. That's going to be mental health friendly. So I want to say, when I talk about empowering people, we don't have to think that only medications are going to be helpful. There are a whole lot of things you can do to empower people. And my final point is taking the lessons from the support groups we have had successfully for drug users on a charitable trust called Sanmati, which is run by wives of some of the psychiatrists. I think we have started a support group for OCD. And this is a bi-weekly one that is running. And this is completely owned, operationalized, and managed by persons with lived experience of OCD. And we are, as psychiatrists, only observers. Complete anonymity and confidentiality is there. People don't come and tell me his names. He just identifies with some name. And caregivers are also free to participate. Over 3 years, our learning in this group is fantastic. I've learned a lot about OCD for the first time in my life than from the textbooks. And these people have helped themselves, and more than the anti-obsessive medications I've been giving them, this OCD support groups have been the vital reason why they are stable and functional. They may still have the obsession, but still may have the obsession, but they understand that obsession is not coming from their own brain. They don't have to own it. And I think they can distance themselves away and can be functional. And that ability to function is the reason why we need a support group of this kind. And lastly, I want to finish by saying, we are now embarking on a journey. Personally, I am embarking on a journey. I've deviated from substance use, my work for over 30 plus years. In the past 5 years, in collaboration with SCARF, I'm doing work with youth mental health. Thanks to people like Vijay Raghavan, Shiv Prakash, and I think there are brilliant people in SCARF who are actually stimulating me for this kind of work. I've learned something. And I think more about this afternoon, you can hear in the youth symposium, Dr. Vijay Raghavan will be conducting. I want to say, this has been a huge journey for me because I've seen youth as beneficiaries. Now I'm understanding youth are the researchers. They are not just beneficiaries. Youth are the ones who are setting up the research question. I am not the right person to ask the right kind of a research question. They set up the research question. They are involved in the design. They are involved in the collection of data. They are involved in the implementation. They are involved in the evaluation. They are involved in the interpretation of the results. They understand the implications of it. I think of them as advisors. I think of them as advocates. And that is what will be going to be the future of tomorrow. And I think people here, some of you gathering here, I would strongly urge you to attend this workshop by Vijay Raghavan and his group. Thank you so much. And I want to conclude by saying, we need to take many things forward as mental health professionals if we really have to help people with lived experience and the caregivers. The initiatives that we take should actually be embracing empowerment, include social inclusion, provide every opportunity, reduce the discrimination, and benefit the communities, not just the families and the caregivers, but also the whole community. Thank you so much. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Suresh, for a wonderful presentation. You have really empowered all of us who are listening to your presentation. And we are going to empower our patients through learning from this session. You have really made a very good presentation on how to improve our practices and finally give the benefit to our patients, empowering the patients, so sharing our information, making them the partners in the treatment, and about active ingredients. He has very clearly expressed all the active ingredients which are going to help in final treatment outcome of our patients. And we have a few more minutes for discussion, and there will be a best prize for the best question also. And I request Dr. Ramakrishnan to make a few comments before we go for the question session.
Thank you, Ashok sir. Thank you, Suresh sir, for a difficult topic made easy. See, that is the strength of Dr. Suresh Kumar. I like to share a few of my experiences in empowering patients and knowledge sharing. One thing I found out, degree is not important in psychiatry. Talking to the patient and the family is important. You may be a PhD scholar, unless you reach them and gain the confidence, that is important. See, diagnosing schizophrenia is a simple thing. Now, of course, what I'm telling in a lighter sense. In one session or two sessions, we will diagnose schizophrenia. How to convey the message of schizophrenia to the family? They are in shock. They don't know what I'm going to tell. That is the anxiety. Of course, they will not take treatment for 2 years and then coming. But the moment they enter the psychiatrist chamber, they want he can be cured. See, the message is how to deliver the message that it is a chronic illness and other things. That I take more time than treating with medicines. First, I talk to the psych, and I'm telling you, this is the way, this is going to be, science is improving. What prescription I give may change tomorrow, better medicine may come. So in that way, because I cannot say it is going to be a lifelong treatment, they will be shattered. See, one experience I had. One lady was asking, he is a person with this chronic schizophrenia. Every time she was asking me, will he get cured? Will he get cured? Every visit. I told, that is in my guilt. I tell you one thing. See, for the 10 years I have been treating him, and every time she wants him to be cured. And he is on clozapine like that. And one day, Amma, I have told many times, I told what is reality. Please accept that. You won't believe, next day she committed suicide. Mother, only son. That was, I think, I don't know what better I would have told that patient. See, that are the things that we'll learn. We learn from every patient. Patients are our teachers, not textbook, as Dr. Suresh told. Patients, every phenomenology, every social culture, difficulty, everything, patients are going to teach us. So spend time on that. See, one thing, once my practice started picking up, I found it very difficult because people come to me to talk to me. Then I had a time when I couldn't 50, 60, 70 patients improved, increased. Then I thought I should have other faculties. Then Dr. Rajaram came, then Arun Kumar, all came. Now we are a team of 7 psychiatrists. We don't say we see each 100 patients. We see 30 patients or 40 patients, quality. Counselors. All these knowledge sharing, educating the family itself is enough. Everything will go. Once a patient with a chronic schizophrenia, sir, give him a job. Give him a job. Nobody is taking. Then I thought, come from tomorrow. Now I made him my attendant. That started my daycare occupation, just like that. Now 8 of the patients are given employment in our hospital. They are given provident fund and all insurance facilities, and they're doing much better work. Loyal, and they will be given certain job, and that will be carried out. So another thing, psychiatrists should follow MS Mental Health Care Act and everything, but they should not get fear to practice, or they got the right to make mistakes if it is in a good sense and it is acceptable by medical council also. So don't get panicky for everything. Don't think that what will happen. You do what is right. Your patient's concern is your job. And if you focus on that, even the errors happen, you will not have any legal problem and other things. So far in 30 years, touch wood, we didn't have any patient complaint or any medical legal this thing negligence. No, it has not happened. Because if we keep talking, every inpatient, we should bring them down and talk to the family, group work. These are the ways. See, group work in our inpatient facility helps a lot. Every day there will be some activity. All the patients in our 30, 40 patients family will be assembled. Then something group activity, educating, this type of educating that gives confidence to the patient. See, previously in 1993, I had a difficulty, 1994, 95, I had difficulty in explaining about ECT. But now I don't even have to tell what is going with this thing. So, and I'll tell, the patient needs electroconvulsive therapy, shock treatment, so long, all things. Yes, sir, I have seen that patient, she is improving in the inpatient. See, the therapeutic community, if we develop, that is the success of practice. So, passion for psychiatry, passion for mental health, passion to disseminate our knowledge, these are the attributes that will make all these things possible and reach the unreached. So, we, as Dr. Suresh Kumar, sharing your experience is very important. Don't feel guilty. That is one thing. I tell you now about a schizophrenia patient and how his mother committed suicide. It is my experience. Another experience I tell you, one patient is a bipolar. He recovered very well. 3 years, 4 years is not symptoms, and he is doing very good work and earning 35,000 rupees salary. And he wanted to get married, and we all talked to the family and we will agreed that he will get married. Then one fine day, they saw an alliance and they were okay. They were talking to each other, and he was apprehensive about how he will face life. He had another depressive episode, and he improved. Then 1 week before marriage, he committed suicide. 1 week before, we traced him. We tried to prevent his suicide, but we couldn't succeed. See, these are the experiences which even we should share among our professionals. No, we are not God. We have got our own experiences. This is how my experience, and I live through all the experiences. We are learning, and we should learn from others. Thank you, sir. Any questions, sir? Hey, camera.
Suresh, this is Rajkumar here. You know, when we started studying psychiatry and being trained in psychiatry, it was a paternalistic attitude. We thought that we know best for the patient because we know about the disease. Then came a situation where the patient starts saying, you know about the disease, but we know about the bodies. So include us in your decision making. I'm okay with that. But sometimes we have gone to the other extreme, I think. From a paternalistic attitude, we have gone to a subservient attitude. I'm sorry to go against the grain and then talk like this, but I'm just voicing my opinion based on personal experience. I have worked here and worked in a different environment where the patients are really empowered. I've had patients tell me that, doctor, I don't think I have schizophrenia, I have depression. So treat me for depression. So where do I draw the line and say, this is where my opinion, the patient's opinion is at loggerheads. They're entirely on the different poles of the situation. How far should I adjust with it? Should I be sly and then say, yeah, you got, maybe I'll accept your diagnosis of depression and treat it with antipsychotics. Am I being ethical there? But if I stand on my statement and say, no, you have schizophrenia, if the patient doesn't want to be treated by me, what is going to happen to him? He can go to another psychiatrist, but is it the answer for that? These are the questions. And sometimes what happens is that they would like you to treat them for a particular illness and not for another illness. This has also happened. Like, I mean, legally in UK, the Bonewood decision states that patient has the right to decide about his physical health treatment even if he is chronically mentally ill. That is acceptable. But suppose if the situation is life-threatening and you cannot treat because the patient says no, how are we to reconcile with our conscience? Like Ramakrishnan said that he was feeling guilty that the patient's mother committed suicide. But the opposite of the situation is, should I feel guilty if my advice is not accepted by the patient and then something adverse happens to him? These are the dilemmas I've faced in my own practice. And I wanted to, I mean, I don't think there's an answer for this, there's a solution for this, but I just want to voice my reservations and maybe a contrary opinion to what has been talked about. Thanks, Suresh. I don't need you. I mean, if you have a comment to make, please make.
No, I think, Raj, it is a very difficult situation. I am not, see, when we talk about empowerment, it is not equivalent to being subserving the persons with lived experience. I think we as professionals have the right to arrive at the proper clinical diagnosis and an appropriate treatment. If the person is not agreeing with that, you keep talking to him about the evidence behind your diagnosis and treatment and try to bring him on board. That's all you can do. Doesn't really mean that, if he says, you treat me for depression, you jump and start giving an antidepressant, which is completely unscientific. So I don't really think empowerment means that. Empowerment is the respect for the person, respecting him as an individual, treating him as an equal partner, treating with the dignity. I think how you normally treat people with physical illnesses, you put in the same parlance. That's it. The person will come and tell you that I got a tumor, doctor, but don't operate, but just give me some magical medicine, it'll resolve. No surgeon agrees to that, right? He convinces him and takes it for surgery. I think the analogy is similar. There are some challenges because of the insight issues. That's when the capacity assessment other becomes very important. I don't want to go into that area. I think majority of the people with lived experience have the decision-making power. And there is a small group of people who do not have the capacity, who do not have the insight, and then we are not really talking about them. And I think basic assumption in empowerment is treating them with respect, dignity, protecting their rights, and treating them equally, involving them as far as possible in the decision-making. Thank you. Sir, chairs, I have a session which is unfortunately already begun. It's already there going on in Hall D. If are there any questions? Yes, please go ahead with the question, please.
Sir, a very useful thing, sir. But I would like to know about the microbiome and omega-3 prescription and anti-inflammatory, this thing. Any prescription routinely done or how should be chosen?
No, I think, we do not prescribe an anti-inflammatory agent to treat anxiety or depression. What I mean by that evidence is there is an increasing level of evidence that brain inflammation is an important pathway to the onset of depressive disorders. There is a very close link between a subgroup of depressive disorders and brain inflammation. So I think reducing the possibilities of brain inflammation is one of the mechanisms people have to consider. Today, we do not have the way to do that. If we can do that in the future and understand, I think at least subgroup of some people with the lived experience of depression have an inflammatory etiology, and is very closely linked to psychosocial stress sorts. I think the psychosocial stress sorts is the one which induce the brain inflammation. If you can target that, that's going to be useful. You don't actually prescribe antidepressants to everybody as well. Again, gut microbiome connection is something that is becoming really, really a great area of research. And I think that will be the very important contribution tomorrow. Because at the moment, I think the value of psychobiotics and its value on anxiety and depression is very limited, and it is not really completely evidence-based. But I can tell you honestly, but I think the research will happen in a very different way. The gut microbiome connection is going to be extremely important. And I think that would actually be very important contribution. So I think these are areas of avenues of research. Omega-3 fat, I did mention, there are, like conflicting evidence to that. There are people who promote it, people don't promote it. But I think considering all that, people will come back and say when they are researching, I have done that, it has helped me. Don't dismiss them off. That's all I'm trying to say. When people come and say that it's worked for them, you don't have to approve it completely, but do not disapprove it also. That's the point I was trying to say.
Thank you, Dr. Suresh. We'll be closing it now. Probably then proceed to the next session. Thank you so much for enlightening all of us. We are closing session and we are announcing the best question to Dr. Rajkumar, who has really raised very practical issues in practice. So please come, collect.
Thank you. We close this session.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. That was a captivating session, sir. I would like to welcome Dr. Shiva Verma to honor our chairpersons.
Happy to get this opportunity, sir.